Hi, my name is Sarah and this is Tori, and today we're going to be doing range of motion of hip flexion and hip extension. To start off, our patient has to be lying in a supine position, and hip flexion occurs in the sagittal plane and frontal axis, as well as hip extension. To start measuring, we're going to line up the goniometer. We're going to line up the fulcrum to the patient's greater trochanter, so it should be like right there. And the stationary arm is going to be aligned with the midline lateral side of the pelvis, and the moving arm is going to be aligned with the midline lateral of the femur, lateral femur. And so Tori, can you see that? And so Tori is going to be doing the movement, so make sure it's aligned. So Tori, go ahead and do the movement. Make sure everything is still stable. Like that. So Tori has about 110 degrees for hip flexion, and the normal range would be from 100 to 120 degrees. So Tori is within the normal range, which is great. So now to measure range of motion of hip extension, the patient has to be lying down in a prone position. And right here we got a little cushion to support her lower back, but we just have to make sure that this is still, her hips are still lined up with the bed. And so we're going to be doing the same thing, and we're going to line up the fulcrum of the goniometer with her greater trochanter as well. So like right there, and the stationary arm aligned with the midline of the pelvis, and the moving arm aligned with the midline of lateral side of the femur. So if you guys can see that, so everything's all set. And so now Tori is going to be doing the movement. Go ahead, Tori. Okay. So Tori has about 25 degrees for hip extension, and the normal range is 30 degrees. So she is a little bit under, but not by so much, which is still good.
So now we're going to be taking range of motion of hip abduction and adduction, and they take place in the frontal plane and sagittal axis. So we're going to first start by asking our patient if we can palpate their anterior superior iliac spines, or their ASISs. So is that all right if I palpate those on you? So you want to start at the top and work our way down until we find them. And then we're going to have our patient put their fingers right on them. So if you can just put your fingers where mine are. So then the fulcrum is going to go on the ASIS of the right hip, and then your immovable arm is going to align with the other ASIS, and then the movable arm is going to line up with the midline of the base of the patella. And so we're going to have Sarah abduct her leg, keeping the toes upwards so there's no rotation of the leg. So go ahead and do that. Awesome. And so Sarah is right at about 45 degrees, and the normal range of motion is between 40 and 45 degrees for abduction. And so now for hip adduction, it's the same points as abduction. So our fulcrum is going to be aligned with the ASIS of the leg that we are testing. And then the immovable arm is going to be aligned with the other ASIS on the other leg. And the movable arm is going to be aligned with the midline of the patella of her right leg. So we're going to have Sarah abduct her left leg out slightly so we can get an accurate reading. And then she's going to adduct her right leg in. So go ahead and do that. and make sure everything stays lined up. And so Sarah is right at about 20 degrees of range of motion, and the normal range of motion is 20 to 30 for adduction, so that's awesome.
So now we're going to be doing the manual muscle test for hip flexion. And to start off, the patient has to be seated. And so to start off, I'm going to be stabilizing the patient's ipsilateral iliac crest, so like right here. And the patient is going to be doing the motion, so she's going to flex her hip, and I am going to apply resistance. Good. So the patient would score 5, which means she can hold the position against maximal resistance and go through complete range of motion, which is great. So now we're going to be doing gravity eliminated for hip flexion. And to start off, the patient has to be laying on their side, and I'm going to stabilize their pelvis onto my body. That. I'm going to lift this leg, and the patient is going to be going through the movement. So you can go right ahead, Tori. One more time. Great.
Okay, so for the manual muscle test of hip extension, our patient is going to be lying in the prone position, and we are going to assess their range of motion of hip extension. And then we want to support the pelvis and palpate the gluteus maximus. And then they're going to lift up into extension, and we're going to apply resistance in the downward. And so go ahead and resist that. So that would score a 5, meaning that she has complete range of motion and can resist the maximal resistance that's applied. All right, and so for hip extension gravity eliminated manual muscle test, you're going to support the outer leg and have them facing towards you on their side. You want to palpate the gluteus maximus again, and then you're going to support the pelvis and have them move through the movement. Awesome.
So now we're going to be doing the manual muscle test for hip abduction. And to start off, the patient has to be lying on her side. And we're going to palpate the gluteus medius and then stabilize the ipsilateral pelvis. So the patient is going to raise her leg, and I'm going to apply resistance on the distal lateral aspect of the femur. So go right ahead. Okay, so the patient resisted that very well, and she would score a 5, meaning that the patient is able to hold the position against maximal resistance and go through the complete range of motion. So now we're going to be doing gravity eliminated for hip abduction. And to start off, the patient has to be lying in a supine position, and I'm going to palpate her gluteus medius, and then I'm going to stabilize her ipsilateral pelvis while the patient goes through the movement. So abduct.
Oh, it will bring it.
Great.
So now we're going to do the manual muscle test for hip abduction. So we're first going to stabilize the upper leg at about 30 degrees, and then with the patient on their side. And then we want to palpate the adductor muscles, and then the patient is going to lift their leg up into abduction, and we're going to push down as they resist. Go ahead and resist. Awesome. So that would score a 5, meaning that she was able to complete the full range of motion and was able to resist fully at maximal resistance. So now for gravity eliminated manual muscle tests of hip adduction, the patient is going to be lying in a supine position with their opposite leg hooked over the other end of the table. And then we're going to palpate the adductor muscles again, and then you want to go ahead and stabilize the pelvis as they do the movement and bring the leg in towards the midline. So go ahead and do that. And go back out. Awesome.
So now we're going to be doing the manual muscle test for hip abduction and hip flexion with gravity resisted. So to start off, I'm going to have to raise the leg and extend it to about 30-degree angle. And I'm going to palpate the tensor fascia latae, so the TFL, which is right here. And then I'm going to, so you can hold that position, Tori, and I'm going to apply resistance to the distal aspect of the femur. So the patient will score a 5 on that, meaning that the patient can hold the position at maximal resistance and go through complete range of motion. So now we're going to be doing the manual muscle test for hip abduction and hip flexion. The patient has to start in a sitting position with her hips at a 45-degree angle. And I'm going to palpate the TFL, the tensor fascia latae, and I'm while stabilizing the ipsilateral pelvis, so you guys can see that, while the patient does the motion. So abduct, one more time. Good job.
So one common injury of the hip is a ruptured ligament, and the ligament usually strains or ruptures due to the joint twisting or being overstretched. And you can usually tell by a snapping or cracking sound that occurs when this happens. It can be followed by bruising and swelling and a lot of pain, and then the movement around the joint will usually be limited due to the pain.